what I wanted to talk about in this demo is doing continuous integration and continuous deployment with the SharePoint framework. And I don't have any slides because I'm a developer and we don't use those things. So I'm going to show you a little bit more about how you can automate the entire story of rolling out your SharePoint framework project. And I'm starting from, we want to go from build. If you have tests, you want to be able to leverage tests as well. And then I want to be able to deploy this to multiple, to one or more different environments. Now, everything that I'm going to focus on here is, let me just throw some things out there first. Some of the stuff I'm going to show you is using some preview features from Azure DevOps. They're all available today. You do have to opt into them. I'm using them in production. I've been using them in production for a couple months now. They're very stable. It's one of those things like how Gmail was sitting in beta for 5 years. It didn't really need to be there. I kind of feel the same way about this one feature with Azure Pipelines that I'll talk about. And then another thing I want to mention is that everything that I'm going to show you is really targeted for SharePoint Online. So, and the reason for this is that there is a significant part, the deployment piece to this requires you to use the ALM APIs that shipped and are part of SharePoint Online. They do not exist in SharePoint on-prem. So they're not, only like 2/3 of what I'm going to show you today is only available on-prem. And that's just the build and the testing piece of this. The deployment piece is something else you're going to have to do. There's just not an easy automated way to do this. I know people have figured it out and figured different ways to do it. I'm not going to cover that here. That's way beyond the scope. So let me first kind of give you a where are we today and where are we tomorrow. So we're going to spend most of our time tomorrow. For where we are today is that we can do continuous integration and continuous deployment with Azure DevOps. And I have an article from the SharePoint Framework documentation about continuous integration and continuous deployment that we already have up on the SharePoint docs. So it's the CI and CD. Now, this is focusing on the present day, let's call it the general availability stuff. And I'll show you where you're gonna be able to tell the difference here. And this is just walks you through how to set everything up using the GUI to create the different tasks or the steps that you wanna run, to set everything up, how to go through and set your tests up, how to set up the deployment, all of that stuff. Now, I'm not going to focus on this. This is available today, and we are going to have another article that is going to ship, but we want to wait until like the GA stuff is when the pipelines goes GA. What Microsoft did back at build of 2019 this year is they introduced a new thing, a new kind of refactoring to this stuff called Azure YAML pipelines. And it's part of DevOps. Now, the difference here is that unlike before, where you could define some of your workflow, like your continuous integration piece, you could define it with YAML or through the browser, through the browser-based GUI interface. But your release phase, so once you've built your SharePoint package, your SPPKG, to be able to take that package and deploy that to your SharePoint environment, that was all done through a browser-based GUI, and you could export that or import it, but the language that you would be using is all JSON. And there was no real like super automated way to do all of that stuff. It was all still kind of manual, and I find it to be a little flaky. For me, I like to think of when I do Azure DevOps or when I do any kind of DevOps, I like to have everything expressed in code because it allows me to version any of the changes that we have in our rollout. You don't go to a browser-based GUI where you can end up making your changes, and each change, when you go to make a save, it adds another commit and everything. It's just, I think it's very, very messy. Instead, I like to do everything all through, define it all in YAML and all in code. So the new thing that they've done is that we can do everything with these things called YAML pipelines. And what a YAML pipeline is that this is going to allow us to define the entire story from continuous integration to continuous deployment using a YAML file, and we can define it all in one spot. Now, I'm going to show you two ways to do this. I'm going to show you one way to do this, and then I'm going to show you a way to kind of simplify it, make it a little bit easier that I did. So let's first take a look at what this looks like, at what one of these YAML files looks like. So if you come over here and you take a look at this file, and there's going to be, I think David Warner's dropping a couple links. I gave him a preview of the links that I'm doing today. So he's dropping some links as I go in here and going through some stuff on the in the demo. There we go. There's the gist right there. So let me kind of explain what's going on in this. This pipeline is doing 4 things. It is going to build my project at the exact same time. It is also going to run all of my tests. And if both of those stages pass successfully and there's no errors, then it will then deploy my project to my developer environment, and it will also deploy it to my production environment. Now you may wonder, like, well, why do you want to do it to both? We'll talk about that stuff in a little bit. So here, what is this doing? I'm going to walk through each one of these pieces here, and you may be it gets a little intimidating, but it's actually really slick. So here, this first part, lines 1 through 4, this trigger part, what this says is I always want this pipeline to run all the time, every branch that gets pushed. In this case, you may want this to only run at specific times. So like, for example, like I have a job, I have a separate Azure pipeline that I run for one of my sites. And it runs whenever I do a push to master, but then it also has a cron job that says, go run this at 4 or 5 specific times throughout the day. And because I just want I need these builds to happen at specific times. Forget about the reason why, but just know that there's other options there. This variable section right here, you'll see these used throughout the throughout this YAML pipeline. But basically what this does is inside of Azure DevOps, you can create this thing called a library or a variable group. And what that is going to do is it allows you to have name value pairs where you can go put the dynamic stuff in there. So this would be a great place to put things like usernames and passwords and all of that stuff inside of this. Gary, I'm not sure what you mean by the type of host. I don't know if you mean the agent. Just clarify your question, and I'm happy to answer that. Oh yeah, so Gary, yeah. So in this case here, so Gary's asking in there about the. I'm gonna change his question. I'm gonna be a politician, change his question because I can do the answer a little bit better that way. So what Gary is asking is, when you run this stuff in Azure pipelines, you have the option to run your jobs either on Windows, on Linux, or on Mac OS, or on your own environment, like a container or something like that. You can define what you want to use. I've simplified this one a little bit. I've pulled out the part where you can say what agent you want to use. I do all my builds on Linux. It's much faster than doing it on Windows. But that doesn't mean that Windows is bad or Linux is good or anything like that. You can totally set that. There's a whole option. There's a setting in there within the pipeline where you can set that, and you'll see that in a few minutes. But yes, you can. You have full control over that. Anyway, these groups are also good because one of the other things that you can do is you can also change. So Lou, the question there about the cron, the cron configuration, that's the same for Windows and Linux. Cron is just the standard. That's just an industry term that you're configuring Azure DevOps to run these jobs at specific times. So that has nothing to do with the difference here. All right. One of the nice things, going back to these variable groups, one of the nice things about these is that you can put in things that need to be secured. So like, for example, I have my username and password that I want to use for my deployments in my Office or my SharePoint Online environment. I have those inside of those credentials, and you can encrypt the password so that they're not going to show up. All right. So they won't be readable. And you can also map those things to an Azure Key Vault as well if you wanted to. All right, so let's get into the work here. So the way that this all is done is we have these concepts of stages, all right? So a stage is just a grouping of a bunch of jobs, and all of the jobs have to succeed for that stage to be successful. Now, in this case here, it's kind of simple. I only have one job really for each one of these, for each one of my stages. But here what this is doing is it says this stage is called build, and let's just ignore what depends on for right now. That just means this doesn't depend on anything, which means it's going to run every time. I give the job a name. Think of this as like its internal ID. It's got to be alphanumeric. Actually, I don't even know if it can be numeric. It's got to be alpha, and it's got to no spaces. And then display name, well, that's kind of obvious. Now, what happens when a project is built? You guys are going to recognize this as being SharePoint Framework developers. The first thing we have to do, well, what's going to happen by default without us doing anything is it's going to do a git clone and pull down our entire project. Now, we can have these pipelines set up for projects hosted in GitHub. We can have them hosted inside of Azure DevOps. Doesn't matter. It can be anywhere. In fact, I'll show you one in a minute that's hosted in GitHub, but the pipeline runs inside of Azure DevOps. But you can just think of when you do one of these jobs, when you see job like this right here, it's going to do a checkout, and you can control that if you want. Again, talk about that later. So here, first thing we have to do, we got to get all the dependencies. So I'm going to do an npm install, download everything. The next thing I'm going to do, I need to execute the build. So I'm going to run the gulp task, and I'm going to say I want it to run a target of build. Now that target, that's like the name of the task you want to run. Now there, you see where I'm using the task gulp at 0. So some of you may look at that and say, well, that looks a little weird. That is the beta version or the preview version of the gulp task. The GA version, which apparently wasn't really GA, gulp at 1, had a bug in it. And I found it's kind of cool when you find a bug in something production and you convince Microsoft that it is a bug and they fixed it. The fix is still rolling out. And so I've cut a few things out here. You're going to see where those things were in a few minutes. But effectively, well, I'll explain why in a little bit. You'll understand why. But yeah, I had to explicitly specify where the gulp file.js file was, and when you did it with the at 1, and you may be wondering like, well, I didn't have to do that. Well, again, just hold your horses. I'll come back to that. Second step, we want to run gulp bundle ship. How do you do that? You say run the gulp task. The task is bundle, and the gulp is ship. So you notice here you get these different tasks of these things ahead of time. Yes, horses. There goes Chris wakes up. GA stands for general availability. In other words, it's production, it's released. When you see these tasks, these are things that have been defined ahead of time by the Azure DevOps guys, by the Azure DevOps team. You can also create your own custom things, as I'll do in just a minute. So the last one we had to do, we got to package the solution, generate the SPPKG. So I say, hey, go ahead and build this guy up. Now's where it gets kind of interesting. Now this piece here, no, Ralph, you don't have to. I just do it to be explicit. Now this next piece right here is you want to publish. I want to save this SPPKG file. Okay, so I just skipped this step right here, and let me explain. Let me come back to this in just a minute. Let me explain what's going on here. So this piece right here about publishing the artifact. What I need to do now that I've built this SPPKG file, it's on the virtual machine or on the agent where my build is happening. I need to take that file and put it somewhere shared so other stages in my pipeline will have access to it. And that's called publishing an artifact. So I'm effectively upload this file to a shared folder. Think about it like that, okay? So I'm saying, go publish an artifact. What artifact? I'm using these variables that we get inside of Azure DevOps. And I'm saying, go look inside the current local path, look in these /SharePoint/solution. You guys are familiar with that, and grab this file, right? And I want you to publish that as an artifact named SPFX package. Now you're like, well, wait a minute, where's this coming from? This is coming from this step right here. You have to know when you publish a file, or when even when you upload it to SharePoint Online, to an app catalog, or when you go to install it, you have to know the exact file name. And that can be a pain because every project is going to have a different file name. And so what I did here is I created this little bash script. And what this does is it's running a bash command. Now this works on Linux. If you're doing it on Windows, you're going to have to write a separate command for this. But in this one here, what it's doing is I'm creating this method here. Think of it like a function that's going to run the find something. I'm looking for a file named this, and then I want to get just the base name out of it. So it would be, if my file was hello world.sppkg, then the result of this entire run is hello world. Then down here on this echo statement, what I'm doing is when you use a syntax that looks like this, what it's doing is it's telling, it's going to run something on the command line on the agent, but it's going to get sucked out of the command line into a variable. So I'm saying, create a variable for this task named SPPKG file name, and I want it to be an output variable. Go run this command and stuff the value of this command or the result of it inside that variable, so that I have this thing called get SharePoint package with this variable name. Ta-da, that's where I'm getting the name right there. Make sense? So it makes things a little kind of cool. Okay, well, that's builds running off on the side. I want to test my stuff. So same deal. I've got a bunch of unit tests that have been set up here. So how am I going to do this? Well, again, this is a totally separate thing that's running on a totally different virtual machine or on a totally separate instance. So I need to do everything again. I need to go do an install. I need to do a build, and then I need to run all my tests. In this case here, this was an update that was provided here from somebody in the community. If you have any failures in your test, it's a good idea to say continue on error is true so that you can still publish your code coverage results and your test results. But if there was a failure in the test, I'll fail it when I actually go after I publish the test results. So this is a cool little trick so that you still get all the reporting stuff that you want. Code coverage is just going to show you like what lines of code have been covered. You know, that's all unit testing stuff. We won't dive into that kind of detail right now. All right, so now we've got our build has run and our test has run, and we have an artifact, a couple artifacts that have been generated. We've got our SPPKG file that's been generated. We've got our test results that have been generated, and we got our code coverage report that's been generated. They've all been published to our pipeline. Now the next step is going to be deployment, and I'm doing 2 deployments here. The first one's going to deploy to a dev environment. The second one's going to deploy to a production environment. So the exact same thing. I'm just going to look at the production environment right now. So here, this is a little bit different. This is a little bit different. So see, this depends on, this says only run this. Somebody is not on mute. If you wouldn't mind, please mute yourself. So this depends on, what this is saying is there are 2 other stages named build and test. Remember, we have one up here called test, and we have one up here called build. This says down here, only proceed, where's my deployment? Here it is. This says only proceed with this stage if those 2 things passed. So my build and test are going to run in parallel, and if either one of them fail, no deployment happens. You got a red build, and that's where we go find somebody, find the developer, gather around his desk, and start yelling out shame, shame, shame. Now, this job, if you notice from the builds, is a little bit different because he's no longer a job, he's a deployment. This is a special kind of a job. This is different in YAML pipelines than what we had in the traditional pipelines, because this is indicating that something is going to be shipped. This is kind of like the replacement for the release stuff that we used to do. So deployment, there you go. A display name, going to give it a friendly name, and the environment is something that I can go back and look and see, hey, this environment, let me see all the times I've deployed to this, and I can roll back to the thing that was deployed to it. All this strategy, run once, deploy steps, don't worry about what the other options are there. That's all you got right now is the run once strategy. They are adding additional ones, like if you guys are familiar with green, blue, there'll be stuff like that. All right, next up, I want to do my deployment. Well, how do I do my deployment? Well, yours truly isn't a fan of PowerShell, so we're going to go with the Office 365 CLI. And so what I have to do is that it's probably likely that my agent, or that the Office 365 CLI doesn't exist on the hosted agent. We only need it in the SharePoint Online space. So I'm going to first install the Office 365 CLI. See, Ralph's got a question here. To make things run in parallel means having their own agent in parlance of, no. Agents, having multiple agents, so having things run in parallel is when you have 2 stages. You'll see that. So right now I have 4 stages total. I would have to have, I can talk about licensing at the end if there's time. I really don't want to though, because I'm a developer and I don't like that stuff. But you get one, everybody, if you have Azure DevOps, you get 1 agent. You can buy more agents that can run in parallel. But in this case here, my build would run and my test would run, but they won't run in parallel because I only have 1 agent. Those are 2 separate stages. My deployments, each one of those is going to run separately as well. If I had 2 agents, 2 hosted agents, or if I had, like, say, multiple containers that I'd set up and did what are called self-hosted agents, and there's a cost associated with that, then I could have multiple things and run them in parallel. So if you need to speed things up, you got to fork over a couple bucks. It's not expensive though. I'll talk about that at the end if we have time, but I probably won't. Okay, so I've installed the CLI and now I need to log into the CLI. And so I'm going to do that by saying O365 login, pass in the URL of where I want to go, and then I'm going to type in, say I want to do a password login, and then I'm using different things here. So see where I'm passing in the user login and the user admin password. I cut some stuff out there. So that, sorry, these are variables coming from that variable group that I defined at the top. Okay, so I've logged in. Then I need to go download the pipeline artifact. I need to go download that SPPKG file. I got to download that guy into this deployment stage. Now I have a local copy of it. What am I downloading? The thing that was named SPFX package. Well, that's not really the name. Remember, it's like Hello World SPPKG. So I got to get the name of it again. So I grab the name of it, and then it's just standard deployment. O365 SharePoint Online, add an app. Where's the file? It's right here. Where's it going? There's the URL. This is a site collection scoped app catalog. I'm going to overwrite anything that's currently there and then say I'll skip deployment. Next step, I'm going to do the deployment phase. Ta-da. Okay. And then production's the exact same thing, just going to a separate URL. And you're like, why are you doing it twice? Again, we'll talk about it later. What does it look like? Here's what it looks like. Check this out. So this is one that has been run. We got our 3 different agents that run. So this is an entire pipeline. So if I go to my Azure DevOps for pipelines, so I have one pipeline that's set up. Now, for you to be able to get these pipelines that are shown up here, you're going to have to come over here into your Azure DevOps. It might not look this good. I'm a joke. That's a joke. You're going to come over here to preview features, and you have to make sure that this guy is enabled, multi-stage pipelines. This is what gives you're opting into the preview features of Azure DevOps to do YAML pipelines. Once you do that, then you see pipelines show up here on the left. So I added a new pipeline, and then it'll ask you, where do you want the pipeline to be? So I have it inside of, in this case, it's a GitHub repo. So I'd say GitHub repo, and then it's going to ask me what repo you want to have access to and all that. So which of the different projects you have access to do you want to use? And then you end up picking the file Azure-pipelines.yaml. All right, let's go back to this though. Pipelines. All right, here we go. So here's one that's run. So this is one instance that's run for this guy, okay? Ignore the fact that it broke a couple times. So if I click into this guy, what do we see? Well, here are our stages. There's my build stage and there's my test stage. And notice that both of these guys passed and then they went into the deployments. Can you change variable groups per environment? Yes. And actually, Nick, I'm going to show you how I do that in just a minute, because this is going to get a lot easier in just a minute. So here we can even see all the details of it. You can see what artifacts were published. Well, I can see there's my SPPKG file that was published, and there it is, my Apollo Viewer React. Does the YAML file have to be created manually? Yes, but I'm going to show you how that's easier in just a second too. Here's my test. Remember I published my test results? Sweet, no test failures, right? So I got all my tests got published up here because I published the test results. What about my code coverage results? Same deal. I published the report, so I can even dig in and see all the results from my code coverage, my testing. What about my environments? I can see what got deployed to the development environment. I can see when things got deployed, what the last thing was that was deployed here. Now, back up a bit, check out one of these jobs so you can see some of the details with this. So here's what this guy looked like. So this one took about 1 minute and 50 seconds. You can see here, it first went through, it checked everything out, and then installed everything. So we can see the details of what ran. So it ran npm install. Next step, ignore these guys. They didn't run. You can see how they're not filled in. SharePoint Framework build. So there we go. Recognize all that stuff. Looks like a SharePoint Framework build to me. You guys have seen this before. Now here's where it gets kind of cool though. So remember I said that we've got a deploy to development and I have a deploy to production. So check this out. Their environments. So I had my production environment. Here's why I have 2 separate environments and I'm deploying to both of them, because I always want dev to be having the latest and greatest stuff, but with production, I don't ever want it to manually go out. I want to have a check here. I want to put a manual approval check that's going to force myself to say, you need to manually okay this. And what will happen is this deployment to production will get to this point and it will stop and it will send me an email and say, you need to come in here and approve this. And so when I go into it, I click on the link and I come to Azure DevOps, or I hook up the whole team integration to it. I click approve and then it will flow. So you can have eyes on. Okay, pretty cool. All this stuff works, right? And then you can see here, I'm able to see, let's see, all these pipelines. I'm able to see like all the stages that succeeded, and when things were actually running, I would see things running as well. Okay, now it's all really cool here, but this can be a little challenging to write one of these really big files. So I did something to make your life a little bit easier. So I created this project called Azure Pipeline's SPFX templates. I created these templates. And what these templates are they're separate templates for each one of the different stages, like the build stage or the deploy stage. So I think somebody had a question earlier, which was, well, can I have different like environment variables set for these different things? All that stuff that I showed you a second ago, it looks pretty much the same, except wouldn't it be nice if I could swap out the URL or swap out the usernames? You totally can do that. The way you do that is up here is I've created this template and I've specified all these parameters that have to be passed in. Notice here, I have a default where we're using Ubuntu, but you can change and use a different agent if you wanted to, like if you wanted to use Windows. So I've got these parameters set up for these jobs. So you're wondering, okay, cool. How does it look to actually use this? Well, in this project, if you come over here to the sample, first of all, the help tells you everything on how to do this. In the sample project, there is a SharePoint Framework project here that if you click on Azure Pipelines, this YAML file, you'll see one new thing listed right here, right after the trigger, before you get to the variables. I'm pointing to a GitHub repository. I'm giving it a specific name. It's a GitHub name, and I had to create an endpoint for this. So the endpoint is what's called a service connection. So in my project in Azure DevOps, if you come over here to your project settings, you'll have this thing called service connections, where you have to define a service connection that effectively says, this is how I'm connecting to GitHub, and here are my credentials and how you're going to connect to it. So I set the credentials up and everything. It's separate from the pipeline itself. So once I've set that up and I gave it a name of Voitanos GitHub, I'm saying you're going to use Voitanos GitHub and you're going to connect to this GitHub repo, and this is the repository that you want to get. What that does is that's going to suck in it's going to clone the repo so that now when I get into my build stage, it's then I can then say, instead of specifying out the whole job, I can just say use the template jobs, and then I want to change the parameters. Or like in my deployment job, I'm going to change the parameters to use this name, this username and password, this URL, my dev environment, site collection, anything else I want to do on the top end. And then same thing, I'll do the same thing for production and list that out all right here. So now that entire file that I showed you a minute ago, if you like the template of all the stuff it's got in it, you can do the exact same thing here by specifying using the same setup. Okay. Makes your life a heck of a lot easier. There's also a way that is defined in the README for this that allows you to say, if I only want like the version 1 of these templates, and you don't want to be like, if we make an update to it and we add some new features and change functionality, you may not want your build pipeline to change without notice. So you may want to pin your stuff to the specific thing. And so we tag stuff. You can pin to a specific branch. You can pin to a specific tag. It's all listed there. Okay. And it documents everything you need to do on how you set this up and all the explanation of this stuff. And if you need any more explanation of this stuff, I'll wrap up with this. I have a blog post that explains this whole thing on how to automate and everything, all this stuff, and using those templates if you want. Okay. And so with that, I think there might have been a question or two that came up that I might have missed. So that's everything that I wanted to show. Vesa, and I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody had any questions to this. I believe this should technically work on-prem as well. Jag, I said this earlier, some of it does. It will work on the build and the test stuff should work. Well, your mileage may vary. The deployment stuff absolutely won't work because deployment requires the ALM REST APIs to be able to deploy stuff. So, and that's not on-prem, that's only in SharePoint Online. Second of all, this whole thing with YAML pipelines is a preview feature for Azure DevOps in the cloud version, not for the on-prem version. So what I showed, so some of the stuff that I showed, yes, you could do it on-prem, but I have no idea what the state of whatever they call it, DevOps on-prem or VSTS on-prem or whatever that is. I don't know what the story is there for this. You can deploy to 2019 using PnP PowerShell. The APIs are in 2019. Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, so Azure DevOps Server. Thanks, Vincent. So, I mean, then yeah, you could change this setup here, and if you could do if there's a way to be able to deploy programmatically, then yeah, you can do anything. You can deploy to anything that you want as long as it's scriptable, and That's the biggest hang up that we've had for the longest time. I didn't know that 2019 had the ALM APIs. Thanks for that, Gary. Let's see. Is there a charge for Azure DevOps? So good question, Russell. So the way it works is that if you have, now let's just talk about the hosted version. I'm not going to even try to broach the topic on-prem. For the hosted version, you get one agent for free. Let's see if I can pop this up in my account. So where's my agent pools? Okay, so you get one agent for free. Okay, and that one agent can be a Windows VM or a Linux VM or whatever. They have a template of the different VMs that are available. Okay, so agents. No, that's not what I wanted to show you. Where is it? Let's do. It's in my settings. Oh wait, pool. No, agent pools. I forgot what this was. Adding a pool. Settings. I forget. So if you have a MSDN subscription, you do have Azure DevOps with your account, and you get one hosted agent. So that's like a virtual machine. If you needed, and it comes with, I believe, 30 hours of runtime per month. If you want to go, if you want to add additional minutes, like if you run out, or if you want to add additional agents so that you can run parallel jobs, then that is $40 per agent per month for hosted agent per month. Another option, like I use this company here. Where is it? Volter. So I use this company to set up, to create a virtual machine. It's super cheap. They're dirt cheap VMs. And then I created, I guess you can, I'll show you this too if you want to, if you want to explore. This is very much use at your own risk. This is under my GitHub, I think. I created a container that uses, where is it? Agent. There. I created an Azure Pipeline Linux agent, and this is a Docker container. And so I created a virtual machine that was like $20 a month, and I put two of these containers instances on that agent. And what they do is they connect to Azure DevOps. And as an MSDN subscriber, you get 2 of your own user-hosted agents that you can use. So I was using those. I found I use those for some stuff. I don't use it for other things because they just run into some performance things. But you can do that. If you want to do that with containers, you can definitely do that as well. And so I was doing that to not have to spend another $40. Instead, I was effectively spending $20 a month and getting 2 agents to get the parallelism out of it instead of having to spend 40. If you can add additional user-hosted agents at a tune of $15 per month, you have to pay for the actual the whatever's going to host the agent itself. So if you create like Azure VMs, each one of those VMs is going to cost you whatever the consumption is for those, and then you have to pay the $15 tax to hook it up to Azure DevOps. That's what you saw when I went over to these pools here, and you saw a list of all of these agents that were dead. These were old containers that I wasn't using anymore, and I just recently killed these guys as well. But these are different Docker containers that are running in that Volter VM. Russell says, asking about a macOS agent, can we build iPhone apps on Azure? Absolutely, because that is a macOS agent. You can totally do that. And I think that's all the questions. I don't think I missed any of the questions. Okay, that's it.